Happy Tuesday to all of you. I hope you're enjoying your day and enjoying today's lunch, and I know you are going to enjoy today's speaker. So very grateful to Professor Christina Riehl for joining us, professor in Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. So we share a building, and we will share a building with the EEB, HMEI does, and we really value our relationship with the EEB. Christina works on a number of really interesting topics, and as I was reading about them, I was like, oh, I wish this was about people. Why and how do people that are, animals that are unrelated cooperate? Right? Questions about collective decision-making from the animals. Questions of coevolution of hosts and parasites, right? We have been dealing with that in recent years. And I think that the work on the animals is, of course, intrinsically interesting and valuable because of that. It's also interesting and valuable to understand the animals. But I think the animals as models for ourselves are also presenting an interesting question. And I think today's topic that links to conservation really brings human decision-making into the picture. And so I'm really excited to hear about this, what seems to be at a big picture, fundamentally interdisciplinary talk. So with that, Christina, thank you, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Gabe. So as Gabe said, I actually mostly study animal behavior. I study tropical birds, and most of my research has been on the evolution of breeding systems, cooperative breeding systems, brood parasitism. But today I'm actually going to talk about sort of a second line of research. And this is something I kind of backed into along the way by virtue of doing long-term studies in the tropics. When I first started in graduate school, I remember someone telling me that the best kind of PhD dissertation you could do was to pick one that had to do with climate change, that was also interesting, and that would get you in the news. And I was like, okay, well, climate change isn't my thing. I study animal behavior. But I think anyone who does long-term studies actually winds up studying climate change and environmental effects, because I've been studying birds in Panama for 20 years now, and in those 20 years, we're already seeing effects of a hotter and drier climate. Although I am going to talk mostly about tropical birds today, I want to sort of set the stage for this by talking about the temperate zone. Because as behavioral ecologists and as environmental ecologists, most of us were trained in the temperate zone, and our thinking is shaped a lot by what animals experience in temperate environments. So if you go outside right now, you might see big flocks of birds like these common grackles. This is the tail end of fall migration. We're at the beginning of November. Fall migration is just winding down. And birds like common grackles are starting to leave New Jersey to winter in the southeastern United States. Birds that breed farther north and birds that winter farther south have already left. This is all, they've been long gone. This is a map that I pulled from the Cornell Birdcast from last week when I was preparing this talk. And this is basically a migration forecasting map showing the predicted intensity of fall migrants throughout eastern North America. And what's happening here, even as late as October, is that the temperate forests are emptying out right now. If you go walk around the Institute Woods, you're going to see only a tiny fraction of the birds right now that you would see if you were there in the spring or in the summer. And what that means, what the seasonality of temperate forests means, is that for a temperate songbird, like this wood thrush, which is a migratory species, they breed in temperate woods in New Jersey, in the Institute Woods. They winter in Central and South America. Life for a wood thrush is a race against the clock. So they arrive on their breeding grounds in the spring, and they only have a few months to raise a family, to reproduce, and then to leave again. That sort of short breeding season, that constrained breeding season, has led to the evolution of life history traits that are adapted for this short, constrained, temperate breeding season, like large clutches. Wood thrushes typically lay about 4 eggs. Many temperate zone birds lay larger clutches of 5 or 6 or even 7 or 8 eggs. If you look at something like a ruby-crowned kinglet, they might lay 10 or 12 eggs in a clutch. They have pretty uniform behaviors to raise those young. Most temperate zone songbirds, the vast majority, have biparental care, where a male and a female form a pair bond. They both raise the young together. But these pair bonds are pretty short term because these adults are going to leave their breeding territory at the end of the summer. They're going to migrate a really long distance. They're going to fly over the Gulf of Mexico. And who knows whether these two birds will still be alive or find each other in the next breeding season, right? So their pair bond is stable within a breeding season, but it probably won't last for years. Similarly, when they raise these young, their period of parental care is also very short. They get the young out of the nest, they fledge them, they feed them for maybe another week, and then after that, they're done. All of the members of this family will migrate separately. They might never see each other again. And wood thrushes also don't live very long because that migration is really costly, it's very dangerous. And so temperate zone songbirds tend to only live a couple of years. And that's not just because of their migration. If you think of a chickadee or a kinglet that's staying in New Jersey over the winter, there's not that much food over the winter, it's cold, most of those animals will die. So even resident songbirds in New Jersey have pretty low survival over the winter. So the problem with this as sort of the template for avian life history evolution is that even though this is sort of the foundational model that we think of as like the default for birds, most birds don't live in that constrained temperate climate. This is a map that probably looks really familiar to many of you who study animals. If you look at just species richness, the biodiversity of plants. This is for birds, but you could look at plants, you could look at almost all taxa. Biodiversity is highest in the tropics, and most of the world's birds live in tropical latitudes. You could almost put a line through these red and yellow areas and see the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn on this map. So, there's a lot of study that's gone into understanding why that is, why species richness is so high in the tropics. But for my purposes today, I think the important thing to remember is that those temperate zone life histories really don't apply in the tropics because tropical birds have a really different set of constraints. So tropical birds breed in forests that are seasonal, but that seasonality is usually determined by rainfall. So most tropical forests, except for the very, very wettest rainforests, most tropical forests experience a dry season and a rainy season. But those are much longer breeding seasons for birds than the temperate zone short breeding season is. And importantly, even though there's a dry and a rainy season, most tropical birds don't migrate. They're resident on these territories year-round. They stay in the same place. When they move, like when chicks fledge from the nest and have to go find their own places to live, they also don't move very far. They typically move 1 or 2 territories over. This is a chestnut-crowned ant pitta, by the way, it's actually not a rainforest bird. They breed in moist forests and montane forests. But their breeding season, like most of the tropical birds, is determined by rainfall rather than by temperature. And because they have a very long breeding season, like 8 or 9 or 10 months, as opposed to just 2 months in the temperate zone, they have much smaller clutches, but they breed a number of times. So a temperate zone songbird might only breed once or twice in a year. They might raise 1 or 2 clutches if they're lucky. These ant pittas might breed 7 or 8 or 9 times in a season. And so they have small clutches, but when those clutches are successful, they care for the young for a long time. Again, they're not constrained by having to leave their breeding site at the end of the breeding season. They can actually afford to invest a lot more in their young. They have prolonged periods of parental care. And similarly, the adults, the male and female that raise these young, tend to have pair bonds that are much stable over longer terms. So instead of just randomly assorting with another mate in the following season, a male and female will actually stay together year-round, and they maintain that pair bond and they defend their territory year-round. And this kind of stability, the sort of ability to defend a territory, has led in many cases, although not in antpittas, it's led in many lineages to living in extended family groups and to breeding systems like cooperative breeding, where you have more than just the parents raising the young, which, as Gabe mentioned, is one of the things I've spent a lot of time studying. So if you kind of think about these temperate and tropical life histories, you can sort of think of them on a continuum between the sort of the live fast, die young strategy of a wood thrush and the sort of more slow tropical pace of life history strategies, where you have higher adult mortality imposed by migration and by the harsh winters, with tropical birds typically living longer and having lower adult mortality. These guys can only breed a couple times a year, whereas these can have many broods a year, selecting for large clutches, lots of young, small clutches, and just generally more movement, right? These guys are moving longer distances between where they were raised and where they might ultimately settle to nest. And so most of my work has actually focused on like the behavioral implications of these life history differences, especially things like how this affects the diversity of parental care systems we see in the tropics and the social bonds that we see emerging among birds that are raising young together. But today I'm going to talk about the implications of these life history differences, not just for behavior, but also for their conservation and for understanding some of the population dynamics of tropical birds, and especially how these life history traits affect sort of population level responses, the demography of these populations to environmental effects, to environmental change. And so for the rest of the seminar, I'll really talk about how these tropical life history traits affect the demography and conservation of tropical forest birds, mostly in the lowland, moist or wet tropics, where I've spent most of my work, my career studying in Panama. So I'll talk about two different projects. One is really about climate and environmental effects. And sort of the broad big picture question here is, how are tropical forest birds going to respond to environmental change? And we don't really know, right? We don't know exactly how climate warming is going to affect the neotropics, and we certainly don't know much about how individual species are going to respond to those changes. But what we can do is we can leverage data we do have on what we already know about breeding birds and their demography, their reproduction, their nesting success, their survival, with long-term data on natural climate variation. And I'll particularly talk about my long-term study of greater anis. This is a drawing of a greater ani by Josh, a really talented artist in my lab. And we'll talk about the long-term data set we have on greater anis and how we can correlate that long-term data with natural variation in climate that we've seen over the past 20 years, which is largely driven by the El Nino-Southern Oscillation. I'll talk about some of the major changes we see in ani reproduction driven by these climate effects that mainly have to do with the frequency and timing of reproduction and some of the implications that that might have for forest birds more generally. And then in the second part of the talk, I'll talk about a very different challenge, which is forest fragmentation. So forest fragmentation, unlike these climate effects, we actually have a lot of information on how that affects birds, both temperate and tropical. But one thing that's been sort of a black box for many years is how fragmentation affects nest success, nest predation, and nest survival of tropical birds. This has been a huge debate in the literature in the temperate zone. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we know and what we don't know about the tropics. Recently, with a former Princeton undergrad who is actually supported by an HMEI internship, we put together a huge global data set on nest predation rates in the tropics, both the old and the new world tropics. And I'll talk about some of the really cool findings that are coming out of that data set and how they're maybe not quite aligning with the paradigms that we think apply in the temperate zone. So to start with climate and climate effects, over the past, say, 15 or 20 years, community ecologists in the temperate zone have done a huge amount to try to understand responses of temperate bird populations to a warming climate. And this work is really structured by sort of first principles about what we know about climate predictability in the temperate zone. Because If we think that temperature is one of the main variables that's going to change in the future, we have a lot of data on how birds respond to temperature in the temperate zone. We have long-term data from things like Christmas bird counts and breeding bird surveys. We have lots of individual species-specific studies on how birds time their reproduction to coincide with temperature, migration arrivals. We have huge citizen science databases like eBird. We've got a lot of data about temperate birds and how they react to changes in temperature. And we can look at these things because it varies predictably with latitude and with time of year in the temperate zone. So we know, for example, that as the climate warms and as mean temperatures rise, birds at lower elevations move up to higher elevations to sort of stay in their preferred thermal niche, to remain in the habitats that they prefer. We know that bird ranges are generally shifting northwards, particularly for species that are sensitive to temperature effects. This is a map generated by the Audubon Society for projected range changes in common loons, which are of course not a forest bird, but they are a boreal breeding species that are pretty sensitive to temperature effects, showing how their wintering range in blue and their breeding range in yellow is expected to move northward over the next 60 years or so. And this is something that's been seen in a number of species already, ranges starting to shift northward. And if you think about the way that temperature varies over time in the course of the year, temperate breeding birds also are shifting their migration, so their arrival times on the breeding sites, as well as their timing of reproduction earlier in the year to sort of match these earlier springs and earlier green-ups we're having in the temperate zone. So we have a good predictive framework, right, to understand how temperature changes should affect temperate zone birds. But we're really lagging in being able to make these kinds of predictions in the tropics. Because not only do we lack the sort of predictability of what these sort of future warming changes are going to bring, we also lack this huge body of like natural history data and regular censusing data that we have in the temperate zone to even understand like the mechanisms by which tropical birds might respond to similar changes. And these are important things. I mean, if you talk to avian community ecologists in the temperate zone, they're interested in using these kinds of data to predict things like which species are going to be most vulnerable to climate change, where are the climate refugia going to be, which of these changes that we see can be the result of individual plasticity or flexibility, and which ones might be evolved adaptations, like what's the role of rapid evolutionary response to these selective pressures. So the situation is more complicated in the tropics for a couple of reasons. So as I said before, seasonality, it's not that the tropics are totally aseasonal. Most forests in the neotropics have distinct seasons, and they have distinct breeding seasons for birds. But that seasonality is mostly driven by rainfall than by temperature. If you look at sort of over the course of a year, variation in temperature, it's rather minimal, especially as you move closer to the equator. But variation in rainfall can be huge. These are photographs of Barro Colorado Island in Panama, where I work. This is the dry season and this is the rainy season. And what you can see from this aerial photo is that there are a lot of trees here that have actually lost their leaves, or have, you can see some yellow flowering trees here. A lot of tree species in wet tropical forests are either partly deciduous, so they drop their leaves during the dry season, even in wet forests. This is not a tropical dry forest by any means. In dry forests, these seasonal changes are even more pronounced, and a tropical dry forest in the dry season looks more like a temperate zone forest in the winter, with most of the trees dropping their leaves. And so these, the rainy season and the dry season affect the seasonality of breeding for birds primarily through their food. So for frugivores, for example, for fruit-eating birds, rainfall affects when trees produce fruit, and so frugivores time their breeding to coincide with when most of their trees and shrubs are fruiting. And for insectivores, a lot of the tropical insects, there's sort of this flush of insect prey when trees produce new leaves. And so the timing of leaf phenology is tied to the abundance of insects, which then influences when tropical birds breed. And we know all of this from a lot of natural history data in the tropics. This is a photograph of a spotted antbird, which is one of the most common species on BCI. So this presents us with a bit of a challenge because unlike the temperature in the northern hemisphere, rainfall doesn't vary that predictably with latitude or with time in the tropics. It's very patchy. You can have differences in the rainy and dry seasons in the northern neotropics versus in Amazonia, differences in the extent to which these forests are responding to rainfall changes. So it's a lot more heterogeneous. But I think a bigger problem is that we're lacking the mechanistic data. We lack the sort of just basic biology data on reproduction and survival, linking bird fitness to rainfall that we have for temperature in the temperate zone. We really don't have those data for the tropics. And this is something that, you can look at almost any review paper talking about climate and tropical birds, and it will lament the fact that we really lack the sort of physiology and life history data that would allow us to tie bird demography to changes in rainfall. And it's a big problem because although there's a lot of unpredictability in what's going to happen in the future, I think there's an emerging consensus that most climate models predict that there will be big changes in precipitation in the tropics globally, but especially focusing on the neotropics, that the changes in rainfall, both the amount of rainfall and the timing of rainfall, are going to change and are already changing with climate change. This is a very recent paper that came out of Jeff Braun's group. He's one of my collaborators at the University of Illinois. He's done a lot of work on breeding birds in Panama. And these are maps that attempt to project the change in duration of the dry season across the neotropics. In a very optimistic scenario, this is a scenario with like really aggressive carbon mitigation efforts and if all of the countries really stick to their emissions goals. And this is the sort of pessimistic business as usual scenario if we don't change anything. And so under the business as usual scenario, you can see there's a lot of red here. These are all areas where the projected change in the duration of the dry season will increase. So longer dry seasons over most of the neotropics. And these projections, of course, there's a ton of uncertainty. I mean, there are areas that will probably be wetter as well. And not only will sort of average rainfall and the timing of that rainfall change, but things like the frequency and severity of unusual climate events like fires and droughts and El Nino and flooding, like those things are also predicted to change. So we don't really know what's going to happen here, but I think even under the best case scenario, there will be changes, and we still don't know how birds are going to respond to those changes because we sort of lack this basic natural history information. Another interesting thing to note here is that this is something that hadn't really occurred to me until I looked at these maps and thought about the implications for birds, is that if you think about the temperate zone, climate warming has actually lengthened the breeding seasons for a lot of temperate zone birds. It sort of stretches out the amount of time that birds have to reproduce. In the tropics, it's the opposite. Lengthening the dry season means it actually shortens the breeding season for most tropical forest birds. So we don't know what the implications are for breeding birds, but it's likely that they're going to be very different from what we see in the temperate zone. And like I said, we don't have a good framework to understand these changes. But we do know that they're important because there are already population declines in tropical birds. These are 3 very recent studies, and to me they're very alarming. You guys might have seen or heard of this recent study by Ken Rosenberg et al. From Cornell that came out a couple of years ago talking about declines in temperate bird populations. And I think one of the main findings from that paper was that temperate birds have declined by about 1/3 in the past 30 or 40 years. We don't have anything like those kind of data for tropical birds, but what we do have are a few long-term misnetting studies. And what these studies, the kind of data these studies are based on is basically people who have plots in the forest where they go out every year and they put up misnets and they catch everything that flies into the net. So they're basically just snapshots in time. They're short, it's like a short blitz of taking a census, right? Like what's here right now. But these are very long-running studies. They do these population censuses for a variety of reasons, and these 3 projects were all set up for different reasons. But this is Jeff Braun's 44-year misnetting study in Panama. This is Betty Loisel's study in Tipitini in Ecuador. And this is Phil Stouffer's plot in Manaus. All of these are multi-decadal studies that have been doing these sort of misnetting censuses for birds. And in all 3 cases, there have been pronounced declines in the majority of species at these sites, which is very alarming because these are all in areas of preserved forests, pretty much intact. They're not all in primary forests, but they're in intact forests that haven't experienced a lot of disturbance in terms of roads and fragmentation and development and things like that during the course of these studies. So these 3 studies have presented their data in sort of different ways. This one from Tipitini is just showing aggregated data from all the species at 2 sites within the plots. And you can see the declines just in sort of raw abundance. This is just raw numbers of birds. These other 2 studies in Soberania and in Manaus have split the data up by species. And in both cases, what you're seeing is that these species in red are those that have declined over the sampling period, organized from the most severe declines to the least. And then these species at the top are those that haven't declined or have increased. Same here in Soberania, these species in red are those that have declined. So in Soberania, something like 70% of the forest birds in Jeff Braun's plots have declined over the past 40 years. And we don't really know what's driving these declines, but all 3 of these papers implicate climate change as a likely driver, partly by process of elimination, right? There hasn't been a lot of other stuff going on at these sites, but also because all 3 of these authors have noted differences in the timing of rainfall and the amount of rainfall over the times they've been working at these sites. So we don't know a lot about how rainfall affects these birds, but we do have some hints. So one of the hints comes from Jeff Braun's study showing that if you try to correlate sort of annual changes in the birds that are caught in these misnet surveys, if you correlate those with rainfall, specifically the length of the dry season, there are very few notable effects other than on young birds. So there are no big effects on adult survival. It's not actually killing off adults, but they see fewer juveniles being captured in misnets the next year. So it basically implies that reduced rainfall is probably reducing reproduction in some way. And another common thread across all 3 studies, which I think is actually a pretty remarkable agreement, is that understory insectivores are by far the most severely affected guild. So they're more affected than birds that eat seeds or omnivores or birds that eat fruit. Understory insectivores seem to be the most severely affected. And that also, the fact that there are differences in among guilds in terms of diet also sort of implies that maybe something related to weather or climate or food is a driver here. So the way that I sort of came into these questions was that there are almost no long-term studies on individual marked birds in the neotropics. As far as I know, there are only 3. Mine is one and there are 2 others. And these long-term studies of marked individuals can actually help us answer some of these questions because they can give us the more detailed data on exactly how climate affects reproduction and survival. They can give us that link between climate and demography that these larger scale misnetting studies don't have, right? The larger misnetting studies can tell us about overall trends, but we need studies of individuals and nests and marked animals to know how basically the climate is affecting their reproduction, their survival, the link into demography. This is a photo of greater anis in Panama by Josh. So you can see they have beautiful color bands. And we've been studying anis in Panama for the past 20 years or so, not because I anticipated climate research being done on them, but because they have really interesting behaviors, as Gabe mentioned in the beginning introduction. So anis are cooperative breeders. Which in some ways makes them, you would think, not actually an ideal long-term study to try to understand general effects on forest birds, because in some ways their behaviors are very unusual. They breed in groups composed of usually 2, 3, or rarely 4 pairs. And these pairs are not genetically related to each other. They build a common nest, a communal nest, and all of the adults put their eggs into the same nest and they share parental care of the young. So it's a cool model system for understanding cooperation, which is what I've done through most of my career. But some features of their biology actually do make them very useful for understanding more general climate responses, which is that they're large insect specialists. So they are one of these understory and midstory insectivores that we think are being most affected by climate change. They're also long-lived and they're sedentary, so they stay on the same territory year-round. They have stable pair bonds. They defend a common territory, just like most of the other tropical insectivores, like those antpidas I talked about earlier. But what makes them even more useful is that we have a lot of data on them over a long-term study, and we also have really nice high-resolution climate data from Barro Colorado Island in Panama that we can sort of use to answer some of these demographic questions. And so every year, as part of our regular monitoring and our behavioral studies of these birds, we collect data on things like adult survival, the number of reproductive attempts each adult has per year, their clutch size, how many eggs each female lays, their fecundity, so how these things change over an adult's lifetime, nest success, so who are the nest predators, how many of those nests fail, how many succeed, how many young fledge, nestling survival over the first year, and also dispersal. So we have a lot of these sort of black box type data that are needed to answer these questions about tropical forest bird demography. And I had never thought too much about climate before this amazing undergrad, Zach Smart, joined my lab. So Zach actually got in touch with me before he was a Princeton undergrad and before I had started working here. He found me online and called me and said, "Can I work in your lab when we're both at Princeton next year?" I was like, oh my God, who is this kid? And that turned out to be emblematic of like everything Zach related. I will tell you a lot of stories about Zach during this talk. But so Zach took one look at this as an undergrad and said, "Krista, you have this amazing data set and you have a lot of data on climate. Like, why aren't you doing more with this?" And so for his senior thesis, what he looked at was the sort of natural climate variation that is well documented at BCI over the course of our study and correlated it with some of the long-term data we have on reproduction. This is a figure showing the length of the dry season in days, going from 80 down here to 200 up here, from 1980 to 2010. And you can see that there's a lot of natural variation in the length of the dry season. In some years, the dry season is really short. In others, it's long. And that length of the dry season, it's a sort of convenient variable to identify, but it's not the only thing that's changing across years. So the length of the dry season is also correlated with a number of other things like total rainfall, number of days with high temperatures, things like that. So years with short dry seasons tend to be wet and cool, and years with long dry seasons tend to be drier and hotter. And Maria also did a lot of this work with Zach, so I'll mention her as well. She did her PhD more on behavioral stuff, but she also contributed a lot to these analyses. So that variability that we see across years in Panama, like I mentioned before, it's mostly driven by the El Nino-Southern Oscillation. So whereas time of year is the main source of temperature variability in the temperate zone, the El Nino-Southern Oscillation is the main source of climate variability over most of the neotropics. So basically, we hear about El Ninos when there's an El Nino year, right? But actually what El Nino really is this sort of periodic, rather irregular natural oscillation that happens. In some years, the trade winds that normally push warm water west here, those trade winds weaken or they reverse direction, and warmer sea surface temperatures and warmer water goes back to the western coast of South America, and it causes a number of different effects. In northern North America, we typically think of El Nino years as like warm winters. Those are years where we don't usually have a lot of snow in New Jersey. But in the neotropics, it has a ton of major effects on rainfall, again, quite unpredictable. Some areas of the neotropics actually experience higher than average rainfall in El Nino years. In the northern neotropics, where I work, El Nino years are typically associated with drier, warmer conditions. And I think there's been a lot of research done on the effects of El Nino on some taxa, like seabirds. We know that El Nino causes major problems for seabirds because it changes water temperatures, which changes their food. But there hasn't been nearly as much understanding of how El Nino actually affects wet forest birds. I think most people thought the effects were rather minimal. But it really changes rainfall patterns. And recently, it's gotten a lot of attention in Panama because just in the past couple of decades, there have been two very major El Nino events. One was in 2015, which was one of the strongest El Ninos on record. The other was just last year in 2023. And in both of those El Ninos, they were so strong and they reduced rainfall so much in Panama that the Panama Canal actually had to close because there wasn't enough water to fill the locks and to move the ships through. And so this is a photograph of BCI in 2015, where the water levels are so much lower than usual that they're exposing all of these stumps that were created, like these were trees that died, over 100 years ago when the Panama Canal was created, and they're usually covered with water. But the water levels in Gatun Lake dropped so much that these stumps were visible. And it created, these huge problems in global shipping last year because the Panama Canal had to close, which affected global traffic. But it also affects anis as well as global shipping. So in 2015, I know, even more importantly, in 2015 was when we really realized this. There was this extremely strong El Nino, and this is the proportion of females in the study area that attempt to breed in a given year, that lay eggs at all. In 2015, only about 30% of the population even tried to breed. Like, that's not saying they raised young, they didn't even lay eggs. The other severe El Nino last year was just as bad. Josh was there. He can tell you he and an undergraduate spent the entire summer verifying that anis were not breeding. It's not a very interesting way of spending a field season. But there's a lot of variability over time, but this variation in the proportion of females that are breeding in a given year is very well explained by the El Nino-Southern Oscillation. These are the two most severe El Nino years. This was also a rather dry year in Panama. So we looked at a bunch of different things that could explain this, like what are the local climate drivers of this? This is just associating with just El Nino events, right? But what's actually happening? Is it rainfall? Is it temperature? So Zach looked at a bunch of potential drivers, and rainfall is the most closely linked. It's the best predictor if you just use rainfall. But actually, an even better predictor is simply a number called the SOI index, which is a global measure of how El Nino-like or La Nina-like a year is. It's a continuous measure, and it's basically based on measures of sea surface temperature. It's not based on anything that's actually happening on the ground in Panama. So it's probably not just rainfall that's driving these laying patterns for the anis. It's probably sort of an associated suite of climate variables that tend to co-vary along with the Southern Oscillation Index, which is probably capturing a lot of that variability. So we looked at different ways that this climate variability might affect ani reproduction. The most significant is just the proportion that lay eggs. This is a different way of showing you the data I showed you in the last slide. This is binning years into El Nino years, neutral, quote unquote, years, and La Nina years as identified by NOAA. So these are not like our decisions. This is basically what global climate data says. We looked at the proportion laying, at clutch size, at nest survival, and for the anis that breed, things like clutch size and survival of the young is actually not very strongly affected. 5 minutes remaining? Oh. Okay. We might go just a little over time then. Okay, thank you. So reproductive rate is probably the strongest driver of these patterns. And it's really affecting per capita reproduction. It actually reduces per capita reproduction by about 70% in an El Nino year compared to a neutral year. So one of the reasons that I think this sort of response hasn't really attracted a lot of attention in the temperate zone is that skipping reproduction is really unheard of for temperate forest birds. This is a life history response that isn't even recorded in temperate zone songbirds. Because if you think about it, for something like a wood thrush, skipping reproduction makes no sense. They might avoid reproducing in a bad year, but they're probably not going to live long enough to see maybe a good year a couple of years in the future. The sort of high mortality that you see over the course of the winter is not selecting for this, sort of long game. It doesn't really go with the sort of live fast, die young strategy. And so what this implies is that skipping reproduction is probably going to be more commonly observed for long-lived species, species that actually have the opportunity to recoup whatever energy they're saving by trying to breed in a bad year, to use that in the future. So one possibility is that skipping reproduction should make more sense for long-lived species in the tropics than for short-lived species. And we're putting together new data that indicate that this is probably the case, and that also show that skipping reproduction is more widespread in the tropics than we realized before. This is data from Jeff Braun's study using annual survival here on the y-axis, and the amount that those species reduce their breeding in a drought year, in either the 2015 to 2016 El Nino or the 22 to 23 El Nino. And so for those of you who know tropical forest birds in Panama, we have like the short-lived, cute little golden-crowned spadebill over here, and we have our long-lived anis over here. And so this is generally accordant with what we think from life history theory, basically that long-lived species should be more likely to reduce their reproduction, invest that energy in themselves instead in self-maintenance, and hopefully invest that in the future, in future reproductive attempts. And with our data from anis, we can actually test that. These are new unpublished data looking at the effects of skipping reproduction on survival. And what we found is that the individuals that skip reproduction, birds that don't lay, actually have a slightly higher but significantly higher survival probability to the following breeding season. So basically that implies that skipping reproduction for some of these tropical birds might be more of sort of an evolved life history response. This may be a way for them to sort of buffer these climate effects by not breeding in bad years and then potentially being more likely to be able to survive to breed in a good year. And this is supported by another life history trade-off we see in anis, which is that reproduction is costly. This is showing clutch size versus egg mass. As they lay more eggs, those eggs get smaller. And that's sort of a classic, offspring quantity over quality life history trade-off. What we're seeing here with reproduction and survival is probably another of these trade-offs. And finally, another effect that we see with the anis is that, like most tropical forest birds, we think, they also can delay their reproduction when the dry season lasts longer. They can sort of wait and time their reproduction to coincide with a wetter year. This is work that was done by Josh and an undergrad this past summer. And so the final thing I'll mention, and then I will wrap this up so we can have some time for the discussion. The final thing I'll mention is that, I talked before a little bit about the sort of two ways that these populations could be responding to environmental changes, either by individual plasticity or flexibility in behavior, or by sort of evolved life history differences, sort of rapid adaptation. And I think an interesting one that we're seeing in the anis has to do with group size. So as I mentioned before, they're cooperative breeders. They breed in groups with either 2 or 3 breeding pairs usually. And a really interesting thing to come originally out of Zach's thesis that we published last year is that these climate effects are much more pronounced for large groups than for small groups. Larger groups with more birds breeding are much more sensitive to climate effects than smaller groups are. This is just the Southern Oscillation Index down here going from dry to wet. And this is individual reproductive output for birds in small groups versus large groups. And this was a really unexpected finding because it basically implies that individuals can kind of buffer the effects of climate by changing their group size. This is something that they have some control over, right? This is something that individual plasticity or flexibility could alter. But it also implies that, if you think about group size or cooperative behavior as also a trait that's under selection, the way that selection affects this trait also varies with climate. These are just the selection coefficients on group size, basically how beneficial is it to be in a large group if you're an Ani. And it's really only good in very wet conditions. These are the 3 wettest years in the data set. So I think this speaks a little bit to both the sort of long-term and short-term responses that we might expect to see, and also to the importance of sort of single species studies and illuminating some of these more nuanced responses to climate that we would never capture in the sort of broad population census framework. Okay, so I will wrap this up with part 1. At least you guys got to hear about climate. I think that what we're seeing in Anis, and probably more generally in tropical birds, is that we're going to see reduced reproduction with these longer dry seasons. But it's probably not going to affect all species equally. And we really need to think about their life history and whether or not there are other trade-offs that we might see over the course of their lifetimes. There's likely going to be changes in the timing of laying. And for Anis, at least, we also see the possibility that behavioral plasticity could sort of modify some of these effects. Okay, so with that, I will wrap up. It's 1:20, and Gabe and I will be happy to take questions.
Okay. So for those of you online, I'm monitoring here the questions. For those of you here, please raise your hands. We have some people running mics. As is the case, the first question should be from a postdoc or a grad student, and there we have Paul with the first question. Getting it started.
This is a question about skipping reproduction during the dry years. So if you condition for the individuals who skip reproduction, are they more likely to reproduce next year even when there might be drought conditions? And what do you think will happen if those conditions persist? Will there eventually be some sort of pushback, and will they reproduce nonetheless even though the conditions aren't favorable?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the short answer is it's kind of complicated because there are also condition effects going on here. Like you could imagine a bird in good body condition or a young bird might have, there might be different costs associated with breeding in a given year or skipping. What I can say is that whatever beneficial effects there are of skipping reproduction, if you look at lifetime fitness, those beneficial effects do not actually compensate for the cost of skipping reproduction. So if you look at sort of determinants of lifetime fitness for an Ani, the number of breeding attempts is a big one. The number of years they live is also a big one. But breeding in 1 year and skipping breeding is a big cost. So the sort of buffering effects of potentially the increase in survival isn't totally compensating for the cost of skipping reproduction in a year. Whether they're then more likely to breed in the next year if they skip reproduction, that's also difficult to answer because in good years everyone breeds pretty much. And so it's a little bit tricky to say that a bird that skipped reproduction is more likely to breed in the next year. We haven't really seen that. Good question, though.
So there'll be maybe other questions. I had a question with regards to the differences between the temperate zones and the tropics. Do you think there's anything to do with not just sort of to the predictability, the fact that in this area the anomalies tend to be seasonal. If you look at somewhere like New Jersey, weather fluctuations dominate, right? Like a season that is dry isn't dry any given week. This is an unusual period we're living through right now, or a season that is hot, there'll be like a heat wave. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of the time may even be colder. And so maybe the animals have a hard time calibrating their behavior.
Yeah, I think unpredictability is a big part of it, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why I think the most kind of productive place to look is to try to understand what are the mechanisms behind any of those responses, rather than predicting what the actual climate might look like or what the responses might look like. I mean, in terms of the sort of heat wave and seasonal anomalies, those happen in the tropics too. You know, when you can in a La Nina year, you might get really heavy rainfall for a week that might cause a flood or something like that, and those things can have non-linear effects, right? So I don't think that I think the unpredictability is a big thing. Yeah, I think that's a big deal.
Let's get you the mic so that everybody can see her.
Christy, I was interested in the phenomenon of the understory insectivorous birds in the tropics declining. And you had suggested that in the case of the anis, one tactic that they might have to ameliorate the climate effects, if that's what's driving declines, is by adjusting the group number and breeding. Mm-hmm. But am I correct that the vast majority of understory insectivorous birds in the tropics, or at least in your sites, don't behave that way? In other words, they really are locked into a biparental care system, and so do not have that as a potential adaptation to weather dry times.
Yes and no. I mean, you're right that a lot of birds don't. And for most birds, I think it's probably changes in the timing and frequency of reproduction that are going to change, rather than behavioral changes in parental care. But I mean, probably 25% of tropical forest birds are cooperative breeders. You know, things like tanagers, cooperative breeding is rampant. And they don't breed cooperatively in the same way that the anis do. They tend to have helpers at the nest that are relatives, but that's something that absolutely varies with climate. And in fact, climate variability and unpredictability is thought to be, like, sort of over evolutionary timescales, a major driver of cooperative breeding to begin with. So I think it's, you know, there's not a lot of data on it. And in fact, we don't even know how many tropical birds breed cooperatively. But from the ones we do know, like, I can think of a couple of Caribbean studies, white-breasted thrashers, things like that, where there have been links between the frequency of cooperative breeding and climate. So it's very species specific, right? But I think we shouldn't discount it as a possible adaptation.
So we have a question online, and it'll get, maybe you can get to the, so here, when anis skip breeding, is that a conscious choice, or does the dryness cause a physiological effect that prevents breeding? And I don't know how you get in their state of mind, or.
Yeah, I mean, what I can say that we do know is that it does affect their physiology. We know that food availability affects their physiology, and that that breeding is very expensive. Females have to produce a lot of eggs, right? And that we know from just regular data that they're waiting until the rains come to do this. Whether or not that's conscious, though, we don't know. I mean, it's very unlikely that it is, in the sense of what humans would think of as a conscious individual decision. It's unlikely that they're weighing their options in the same way that we are, because we see similar behaviors for young birds and old birds, inexperienced and experienced birds. So it's probably not a conscious decision, but there are certainly behaviors that go into reproduction that they're not expressing before they reproduce. So it's not just like they're automata either.
Okay. We have.
So I guess this is a question about evolution. So, of course, birds evolve over time. They adapt to changing environmental conditions. This is given anyway. So the question would be and as you showed, there is a decline in just even on a mass scale of species survival. So, and if it is human-induced climate change, okay, so it has to do with the rate of change of the environmental conditions. If the rate was slow enough, then the birds could adapt to the situation, and it would be, I mean, they would evolve to something else, whatever. But I guess the question is, does your data show that the rate of change is accelerated from, say, from geologic time, or I don't know what time scale was an appropriate one. But is the rate of change changing such that birds can't adapt? That's the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would have to, I haven't seen rapid evolutionary change in my study, but I think that you can very easily imagine that for certain things, for certain traits, under strong selection, they could evolve very rapidly. I mean, if you think of things like group size, that's something that is partly shaped by natural selection over evolutionary timescales. This is like an ancestral, cooperative breeding is an ancestral trait, but it's also something that's partly plastic, right? So these things could change quite rapidly. It's hard to look at the kind of data we have for those population declines that are community-wide and point to specific adaptations that might be evolving in real time. But I think that what we have lacked previously is the kind of individual level data that even allow us to understand which traits might change, right? So I think things like the timing of reproduction, that's another one that's partly under genetic control and partly under environmental control. And so you would imagine that there's a plastic component to that behavior that can change, and also a component to that behavior that is under selection over longer timescales. And absolutely, if selection is favoring birds that can time their reproduction more precisely to rains, for example, there's no reason that that trait couldn't evolve rapidly in a population.
I think, did I imagine? Yeah, there with the yellow glasses. Right.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was really great. I was wondering if you guys had looked into some of like the fruiting phenology data or like leaf phenology data, because that could be a really useful thing to like add in to test some of those like mechanistic links between what is actually changing in terms of the resources and then how that affects the bird behavior or breeding or something like that.
Absolutely. And I think that is always like the thing I wonder about, is not necessarily for fruiting for most of these birds, but for the insects. Like what I would really love to have is the sort of equivalent of the breeding bird survey or the Christmas bird count or eBird for tropical insects, because I have looked and failed to find good long-term data looking at insect abundance and rainfall in a tropical environment. There are great data on plant phenology. The plant people have been all over this. They have long-term plots, they have tagged trees, the trees don't move, it's great. Insects, not so much. So, there are like a few studies that have done like pitfall traps where you get like some insects, but it's really hard to census all the insects in a tropical forest, particularly the ones that birds are eating, and to look at how their populations are changing. I think it makes a lot of sense that insects don't like hot, dry conditions either, and that I wouldn't be surprised to see that their populations change, that their abundance changes with climate as well. But yeah, someone should study that.
Okay. So I'm taking one last question, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Hi, so I had a question about how maybe studying responses of specifically bottlenecked tropical bird species might give different or more valuable insight into climate response. So I was thinking specifically about the Mauritius kestrel, which had a severe bottleneck in the 70s and then recovered, and they've been studying it long-term since then, and they've been observing behavioral plasticity and adaptation and also response to rainfall. I'm just curious what you think about studies that focus on bottleneck species in particular.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have to think about that a bit more, I think. I haven't really thought about it. A lot of tropical birds have really small population sizes to begin with. One of the features of these like highly diverse tropical forests is that you have a lot of rare species that exist at low densities, that probably never had, they have small ranges. There are like a ton of range restricted species in these forests. They probably never had large populations, but those are sort of evolved small populations, if you know what I mean. They're not populations that have gone through bottlenecks. So yeah, I'd have to think about that a bit more. I can't say that I have a great response.
Okay, well, with that, I'd like you to join me in thanking Christina again. And then I'd like to highlight our next speaker, and the final one for this semester will be on, I believe, December 3rd. Is that 3rd? Okay, December 3rd. Sorry, I didn't have my glasses on. The final speaker will be Sarah Rivet from the Department of English and American Studies, and the title of the talk will be The Raven and the Sea. So looking forward to having you here for that.